Okay. Good morning, everyone. How are we doing? Is it that bad? So bad you can't even make eye contact. One, two people, maybe a third person who just walked in can make eye contact. Still a little early for midterms, but maybe are you getting like first exams? Yeah, is that what's going on? Or are you just now into the semester and you're realizing your schedule is leaving you sleep deprived, and why on earth did you sign up for a 9 a.m. class? Nods. Yeah, okay. Well, here's Jasper. And double check that I'm recording. I am recording. Okay. So first, some announcements that don't have anything to do with class. So we, the philosophy program, have two student organizations. It's more or less the same people, but they do two independent sets of things. Sorry. No, I can ignore that. Yeah, so two student groups, more or less the same people, but they do two different kinds of sort of activities or programming. So Examined Life is a weekly discussion group. Anyone who shows up gets to play a role in deciding what the discussion is going to be about. So I think often they do stuff that's been talked about in various philosophy classes, but sometimes they do sort of broader debates about things that maybe aren't being discussed in your classes. We're going to be talking this week about how you have good and productive debates. If that kind of thing appeals to you, then Examined Life might be of interest. The other organization is called MAP. This is our local chapter of an international organization called Minorities in Philosophy. While it has that name, it is open to any philosophy student. MAP tends to do more sort of social programming rather than like intellectually oriented discussion that you get in Examined Life. Last semester, MAP started doing a thing where every 2 weeks they would have a movie screening. The department pays for free pizza for whoever shows up. In theory, it's like you watch a movie and then you talk about philosophical aspects of it, but one of the movies they had last time was Transformers. So these are not artsy intellectual movies. This is really like, we're gonna hang out and have some fun and get to know each other. So if you might be interested, the organizational meetings are like Tuesday, 7:30 to 8:30 every week. I think they are they're just figuring out what they're gonna do for the movies this semester, and as they let us, the faculty, know, I will let you know like what movie is coming up and stuff like that. Any questions about those student groups? Okay. The only announcement I have relevant to class today is that I have to cancel my student hours. I have a bunch of meetings that I have to do today that like had to be scheduled today and just conflicted with student hours. So unfortunately, no student hours today. I'll be available during my regular student hours on Thursday. You can also contact me if you want to meet one-on-one. And of course, Polyphony, who isn't in class today, but will be back Thursday. You can also meet with her one-on-one, and then discussion sections on Friday as usual. Any questions related to sort of course logistics kinds of things? Okay. So then let's get right back into it. So last week, we started mapping arguments. We put claims into boxes. We put arrows running from premises and conclusions. Last Tuesday, we were really just looking at arguments from one side of a debate. Then on Thursday, we looked at arguments from two separate sides of a debate. We started with the relatively simple case of what we call opposing arguments. Does anyone remember the definition we gave of opposing arguments? Jonathan?
An opposing argument is an argument that directly opposes the conclusion.
Yeah, so an opposing argument directly challenges the conclusion of a previous argument. So we had this example here of a debate over whether teachers should be required to tell parents when their children want to use different names or pronouns. It's a little small on the slide, so I'll zoom in. So this trans disclosure debate in K-12 schools, we had a pro argument in favor of this. Pro and con, I'm going to reiterate on the next slide. Which side you label which is often kind of arbitrary and just depends on how you phrase the conclusion. I generally like to stick to the convention of representing pro as blue and con as red. I think that fits in with some connotations we have to those colors. But so in this debate, we have the argument that parents should be notified when their children are experiencing mental health issues, and this supports the conclusion that teachers should be required to disclose. And so both of these claims from the pro side are in blue boxes, blue font, and there's a support arrow here. It's solid, it has a typical arrow head to indicate that this claim, this premise, supports the conclusion. The opposing argument we looked at was that forcing trans and non-binary youth to come out will increase the risk of abuse, neglect, and suicide. This is coming from the con side of this debate, so it's in red. And this argument is meant to challenge the conclusion. And so we represent that relationship with this challenge arrow. We use red again because it's coming from the con side. We make it dashed and we put something like an X or a bar or a double bar in place of the arrowhead to communicate that this premise, that this claim is meant to challenge or block the conclusion. Okay, that's basically where we were last time. I have messed up my Zoom. I'm going to reiterate a couple of points from the last few slides, but this was really the core. What we spent most of our time on Thursday was this idea of mapping arguments. Are there any questions about any of this apparatus? Great. So just to go over a few things, I've said this one a couple of times now, that which side you label pro and which side you label con is basically arbitrary. You can almost always slightly rewrite the conclusion so that it fits with either side. And often, we always present ourselves as being pro something. So in this debate, the pro side, what we've labeled the pro side, can represent themselves as being pro-parents, pro-parental rights, pro-mental health, while the con side will represent themselves as pro-trans, pro-trans rights, and maybe they can also represent themselves as being pro-mental health. Something similar happens in the abortion debate, which we're going to be looking at more today, where the two sides label themselves as pro-life and pro-choice. Everyone wants to be on the pro side, but we have to label these somehow. So it's just a matter of convention who we label pro versus con. It can be a matter of which side we want to emphasize or sort of which arguments we want to start with, but it can easily be flipped. Then the last point left over from last time is that the way we presented this debate up here is really simple, right? We have two arguments, one that supports the conclusion and one that challenges the conclusion. There's a lot more nuance we might bring in. Should and should not aren't the only two possibilities, right? We could have a more nuanced conclusion about maybe under what conditions parents, teachers should be required to disclose. Maybe they, like a recommendation that they should disclose under certain circumstances, or a requirement under other circumstances, where there are a lot more possibilities for the conclusion than just should versus should not. Most people probably don't have a strong opinion on this issue and or can see some merit in both arguments, right? If the core of the two arguments is, on the one hand, parents are supposed to like protect their children and so should be notified if their child might be having mental health issues. A lot of people will see something to that. On the other hand, a lot of people recognize that queer youth are at increased risk. And I think a lot of people can imagine, say, a trans teenager in a conservative household could be at increased risk for abuse, neglect, and suicide. So probably a lot of people can see some merit in both of these arguments. And of course, there are many other arguments that I moderately follow this issue, and I was able to come up with 5 different arguments. Actually, 6 or 7, because some of these have like things you can plug in. There are a lot of other arguments that we could put on this map if we wanted to. Question for you to discuss at your groups for a minute. What would happen to our argument map if we tried to include these nuances? If we tried to make our argument map a much more complex, nuanced, realistic depiction of this debate. Think about that for a moment, then discuss in your tables for a moment. Let's come back together. Somebody at table 9. What would happen to our argument map if we tried to include all these nuances? I said somebody at table 9. We would need more than like one box for the conclusion. Yeah, we would have to have like a bunch of different boxes for all the different possible conclusions. We'd also need like separate boxes for all of those different premises. Somebody at table 3? Let me rephrase the question. So we have an answer just in terms of like, what would this do to our argument map? Would our argument map still be as useful? If we add these nuances, this complexity, would that make the argument map more useful or less useful? Give you a minute or two to think about that, discuss at your tables again, and then I'm going to want an answer from table 3. Okay, let's come back together. Table 3. Would our argument map be more or less useful if we included all of these nuances, all of this complexity, made the argument map more realistic?
I don't think it would.
Okay, why not?
Yeah, a lot of these are useful to think about, but
Uh-huh.
I feel like they're not nearly as important as the main two argument and counter-argument we have. So I feel like just for the sake of simplicity and clarity, it's better to pare it down to just that.
Okay, so for the sake of simplicity and clarity, we want to focus on the two main arguments. And yeah, so the way I originally put this together was based on a story from the local newspaper in my hometown. Those were the two main arguments that were presented in the story, but there were others in the story as well. We might include the other ones that were represented in the story, but probably not every single argument. Other perspectives, other thoughts? Okay, so the take-home message here is that when we're looking at sort of any realistic controversy, any realistic debate, there can be a lot of this complexity, there can be a lot of other things going on besides just the main elements. And a lot of the time, what we care about are sort of the main elements, the key arguments, what people are actually saying to each other rather than other things that they might say. And for the purposes of analyzing a debate, usually we want to focus on sort of what is actually being said or is maybe just under the surface there, rather than everything else that we might throw in. Final questions or comments on that point? Jack, do you have something?
I think you could have like a complete debate. Like if you wanted to completely map out a debate, you could have multiple conclusions on the same one. And then some of the premises could share conclusions.
So there might be circumstances where we want all of the complexity. We want like all of the arguments and all of the possible conclusions on the board. Yeah. Can you imagine like what that circumstance might be?
I think if you were trying to like put together a definitive like guide on all the arguments.
Yeah, so let's see if I can find this real quick. Image, climate, debate, argument map. Oh, what is his name? This might be close enough. There's a particular philosopher who has done that kind of thing with a few controversies, where he has systematically tried to create one big argument map that includes all of the arguments, all of the objections, all of the replies. This isn't it. I thought maybe I was going to get, I think DebateGraph maybe is the organization, but this isn't pointing to it very conveniently. If you spend a little time looking for like argument maps on, say, climate change, you can probably find those without too much trouble. But yeah, I'm not seeing it. So yeah, that is an effort where the goal is to be comprehensive, to show all of the arguments that are being made. And that, yeah, probably is the case where we want all of the nuances, all of the complexity. In a lot of other cases, the ones we're going to be looking at, probably we want to focus on, I would say usually we want to focus on what are the most important arguments, the key ideas showing up in a debate. Anything else? Okay, so moving on to totally new stuff. Last week, I said that there are two ways to challenge an argument. There are actually three, but we're not going to talk about the third one in this class because, in my experience, students have a lot of trouble with it. So we're ignoring a third one. Maybe some of you can figure out what the secret third thing is, but we're not going to go into it. In our context, there are two ways to challenge an argument. We looked already at opposing arguments that challenge the conclusion. We're going to distinguish those from objections which challenge a premise. So if you remember last week, there was a slide about counter-arguments. There are two different things that people mean when they say you should include a counter or a counter-argument in your paper. Often this just means an opposing argument, but in this class, like in philosophy more generally, we're actually going to put a lot more weight and attention on objections, that is challenging to a premise of someone else's argument. So here's an example from the debate over abortion. We're going to start with this pro-life argument that an embryo has a right to life from conception, therefore abortion should be legal. We're going to start with that argument. And we're going to be looking at a debate between two philosophers. First, we're going to have an objection to this argument from the philosopher Mary Ann Warren, pictured here roughly around the time that she wrote this argument. So this is from a paper that she published in 1973. She was roughly 30 years old at the time. This picture, which a friend on Blue Sky pointed me to the other day, this picture was taken when Warren, we don't have the exact date when this picture was taken. It is of Mary Ann Warren, so it is of her. She looks to be late 20s, maybe early 30s, which is about when this paper was published. And based on her clothing as well, it looks like this was something like the early 70s. This incidentally is her husband, Michael Scriven, who was also a philosopher. And this was happened to be at Point Reyes. Okay, so Warren's objection to this argument, as distilled down, if you follow the link, you can read the whole paper if you want. Warren's objection to the pro-life argument is that an embryo lacks consciousness and capacities to do things like feel pain, engage in self-motivated activity, communicate, and have self-awareness. That's a mouthful. We might need to say this a lot in this debate, so we're going to abbreviate all of those together as cognitive capacities. So in other words, an embryo lacks cognitive capacities. But, premise 2, only beings with cognitive capacities have a right to life. Conclusion, so an embryo does not have a right to life. So, thing to note here, we can tell this is an objection rather than an opposing argument because the conclusion here is challenging the premise of the pro-life argument. So this isn't a challenge, this isn't a direct challenge to the conclusion, it's a direct challenge to the premise. Okay, so what I'd like you to do in groups is map just the pro-life argument and Warren's objection for right now. You already have all of the tools that you need to put these things together. So as practice, I'm going to have you do that in groups, and then we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to move on to the reply. Okay. So I will turn on the music, since you'll need a few minutes to do this, and potentially group 9 will have technology issues, hopefully not as bad today. We'll see where folks are in 5 or 10 minutes. Okay, let's come back together. Since everyone has finished the first one. Oh, you know what? I have solutions already. I'm going to do this rather than futzing around in Miro. Just going to do this and grab it. Whoop. Oh, no, of course it's over here. Okay. So, yeah, I think every group got there, got something that looks like this, the equivalent to this. I went ahead and did the pro-choice side in blue. I think that's why there was the typo there. Because on the notes that I copied this from, the pro-choice side was in blue. With an autonomy argument we're not talking about right now. Then there was an opposing argument here. An embryo has a right to life from conception, which challenged the conclusion that abortion should be legal. Then we get Warren's objection. You don't necessarily need to do the name like I did up here. It can be nice, but it's not strictly necessary. Two premises: only beings with cognitive capacities have a right to life. An embryo lacks these capacities. A grouping box to group these two premises together. And then a challenge arrow to the pro-life premise that an embryo has a right to life from conception. So this is an objection because it's challenging a premise. Okay, I think everybody got the equivalent of this. You all had the colors flipped around. So you had the conclusion abortion should be illegal with a blue supporting premise, an embryo has a right to life from conception. But then you put the objection in red and then a red challenge arrow where I have a blue challenge arrow. So whether it's support or challenge doesn't change when we flip pro-con, but the colors of things do change. Okay, good. And every group got this. Are there any questions about this step? Mapping the objection. Okay. So next, on top of objections, after objections we have replies. A reply is simply an objection to an objection. So one side, let's say the pro-life side gives an argument. The pro-choice side gives an objection to that argument. And then the pro-life side is going to come back with a reply, which is just another objection. So we have Warren's objection here. It's not exactly at the top, it's like the middle of the slide. So we've seen that already. Embryo lacks cognitive capacities, but only beings with cognitive capacities have a right to life. So an embryo does not have a right to life. Next, as a reply, we're going to look to this other paper by another ethicist, another philosopher named Don Marquis. Marquis's reply goes like this. Coma patients also lack cognitive capacities. Coma patients have a right to life. Therefore, it's not the case that only beings with cognitive capacities have a right to life. There was a question. I sent some of the groups kind of ahead to start working on this while everybody was finishing up with Warren's objection. There's a question from one of the groups. How does Marquis' reply relate to Warren's objection? What is it challenging in Warren's objection? I'll move the slides onto your display so you can read them a little bit easier. how does Marquise's reply work as an objection to Warren's objection? Devin, I saw your hand first.
I think it's to premise 2 of
Mhm.
Warren's, and
Good. Warren's objection is only beings with cognitive capacities have a right to life. That's premise 2. Marquise's reply is directed at exactly that. It's not the case is a kind of long-winded way of putting a not in there. Therefore, not only beings with cognitive capacities have a right to life. So Marquise's reply is challenging premise 2 of Warren's objection. Jonathan?
In our discussion last week,
Mm-hmm.
we had like a similar concept to replies,
Uh-huh.
and you referred to them as like a third voice or any nth voice after the actual argument. When you map them out on an argument map, do you make them the color of the argument they're supporting, or do you make them a new color?
You make them the color of the side they're coming from. Okay, so you might be interested in a debate with multiple points of view beyond just 2. We aren't going to be looking at that in this class. I think also I remember one of the 2-sentence papers brought this up. The possibility of having 3 or more sides in a debate. You can totally have that, and you would want to represent that with multiple different colors. It would get really complicated really quickly. 3, 4, 5 different positions, and all of the arguments, objections, and replies. We're going to be thinking just in terms of 2 sides, pro versus con. Marquise's reply is coming from the pro-life side, so we're going to stick with the pro-life color. In the case of my notes, the pro-life color is red. In the case of how you all are approaching it, the pro-life color is blue. So just stick with whatever color you used for this premise right here. Okay. Other questions about this? Okay. I think a few groups are mostly here already, but we want to give everybody a shot to do this. What I'd like you to do now is take your existing argument maps and expand them to include Marquise's reply. Okay, I will. Okay, let's come back together. Everyone, I think, did it correct. I'm just going to grab my version from the notes again. And I did not learn and did not make the blank slide. So I have to go over here and grab the screenshot again. Come on. Oh, come on. There we go. Nope. The hell is it? Okay, there we go. So, as everyone got, we have Marquise's two premises. Coma patients also lack cognitive capacities. Coma patients have a right to life. Then these are in the color for the pro-life side, which in my case is red, in your case is blue. And then we have a challenge arrow in the same color. I think a couple of groups, this was a little bit tricky, but everyone got there at the end. The challenge arrow is pointing only at this one premise of Warren's objection. The challenge arrow doesn't point at the grouping box. The challenge arrow isn't challenging all of Warren's premises taken together. The challenge arrow is pointing at one particular claim. And so we pointed at that one particular claim. Everything else looks exactly the same. Nobody had anything super different from this. A couple of sort of stylistic points, not things that would like get you marked down on the quiz, but things that help make the argument maps easier to read, more legible. First of all, there's tons of white space here, right? The font is relatively large. There's lots of, the boxes are relatively generous around each of the claims. Grouping boxes are nice and big around them. That makes it easy to see, for example, this challenge arrow right here is pointing to this particular premise rather than the grouping box. The colors are very distinct. The font is easy to read. I think those were the main things I was going to say. Oh, the other stylistic thing is we're going from the bottom up, and the arrows all point from top to bottom. This means that we can sort of visually see how far a particular argument is from the overall conclusion. Notice Marquise's reply doesn't have anything at all about abortion or embryos in it anymore. Marquise's reply has gotten us some ways away from that original topic of whether or not abortion should be legal. And on the map, these claims are visually far away from that final claim. So that's another stylistic point that you can also use the, if you are arranging things sort of from bottom to top, that gives you visual clarity to the structure of the debate as well. Okay, again, those are stylistic points, making the argument map easier to read, but some of the things you all were doing, acceptable, just not preferred. Any questions about the stylistic stuff? Or questions about this argument map? Okay. A few subtle points. An arrow always points at a single claim. This corresponds to the idea that an argument always has a conclusion at the end. There might be sort of sub-conclusions, or we get to one conclusion and then we get to a second conclusion further from that, but we don't have arrows somehow pointing at multiple things at once. So an arrow always points at a single claim, and it points at a claim box, not a grouping box, even if it comes from a group of premises. Objections never point at the overall conclusion. So we have two objections here, and their arrows don't point at the conclusion. Why is that? Why is it that an objection can never point directly at the conclusion? Think about that. An objection can never point at a conclusion, or at the overall conclusion. When you have a thought, check in with your table. Okay, let's come back together. Why is it that an objection can never point at the original conclusion or the overall conclusion? Elizabeth, do you have a thought? Good. If the arrow pointed at the overall conclusion, we wouldn't have an objection, we would have an opposing argument. So for example, if I ask you, and I'm going to ask you actually a lot this semester, to develop an objection, it can't point at the overall conclusion, and that's something that will be marked wrong. With the comment, you're giving an opposing argument rather than an objection. Are there questions about that? Okay. And then the last subtle point is just a reminder that we can have all four combinations of sides and arrows. I think we get that, we almost get that here in this argument map, where we have a pro-choice argument. We have a supporting arrow from blue, a challenge arrow from red, a challenge arrow from blue. The only thing we're missing is a supporting arrow from red. But we can get all four combinations here. So color tells you the side. The styling of the arrow tells you whether it's supporting or opposing. So we have to keep track of both of those things. Okay, any questions about any of these subtle points? Great. Okay, as I anticipated, you all got through this material faster than I originally thought. So we're going to start this. We're going to do about 10 minutes with this morning, and then we'll pick up for a little bit more Thursday morning. You all are going to have a very boring, highly structured debate at your tables. The debate will be over this claim here. STEM majors should be required to take humanities classes. Now you're going to have a debate but you're not going to divide into sides. What I would like you to do first, as a group, develop an argument either for or against this conclusion. So as a group, pick a side. Let's say you're going to start with the pro side. So develop an argument for this conclusion. Then develop an opposing argument, again as a group, as the whole table. Then give an objection to the first argument, a reply to the objection, and put all of this on an argument map. So roughly, you're going to end up with something like this for this abortion debate on this question of whether or not STEM majors should be required to take humanities classes. For each argument, I'm looking for 1 to 3 premises. So not super complicated arguments, 1 to 3 premises. If everything is just a single premise, honestly, that's fine with me. Varying it up a little bit can be nice. Don't make any of the premises too long or complex. For example, if we go back to Warren's objection, the original premise 1 is kind of long and complicated. I compressed that down to cognitive capacities. Okay. So try to do something similar with any ideas you come up with. And finally, try to use acceptable premises that provide good support. Let's try. That's not a requirement. The point of this exercise is to get more practice mapping out whole debates using these tools we've developed for argument maps. The point is not to put forward really compelling arguments one way or the other on this question. Okay? So the exercise is developing some arguments on either sides of a debate and arranging them all in an argument map, not making really compelling high-quality arguments. We'll get to that part later. Any questions what I'd like you to do? Okay, so we've got 6 minutes left by my phone. So we will start work for those 6 minutes. You might get just 1 or 2 steps into here. That is totally fine. Again, we're going to take more time Thursday morning to work on this some more before sort of sharing some argument maps with everybody. Okay, I will turn on, I'm going to stop the recording here in just a second because this is it for today. But I will turn the music on for folks in class.